Hey everybody, Brad aka Shambazzle Games here with your weekly Dungeons & Dragons news from all around the interwebs for Saturday, January 18th. And this week we've got a bit of a special feature because we're going much deeper into Matt Mercer's pending release of the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. Here we go! Now, first of all, as always, we want to start with some community news. We've got, as usual, a lot of really great things to look forward to this week. Before we even begin, I want to express a humble and grateful thanks to this incredible community for helping us reach 100 subscribers on YouTube and beyond. Thank you, thank you, thank you. What that means is I can now be found at youtube.com/ShambazzleGames. And honestly, I've been working towards that for longer than I probably should have been. But with the new approach to video and video content, it just makes sense that I should be ramping up this property as well. So look forward to much more excellent video content focused on bringing value to you as DMs, GMs, and players in the world of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to have to make some shifts in how I produce content because shooting video and editing it takes a lot of time. And for me, the most reasonable cut, if you will, to make was to reduce my streaming. Unfortunately, that means I'm taking a step away from Twitch and further into YouTube. But the benefit of that is I'm going to be focused on producing more value-added content for you as a viewer, as DMs, as players. Less rhetorical, less hypothetical, and more tactile things to help you do whatever you want to do in Dungeons & Dragons, whether it's campaign setting, world building, game design, dungeon mastering tips, player tips, online, offline, anything that we can think of that really relates to the game of Dungeons & Dragons. So I want to bring it back to my roots, which started in DM and player tips, map making, and miniature painting, as well as game and campaign planning overall. That's how I began 3 years ago, just drawing maps on my bed with an overhead camera and a standing lamp to light my way. So I'm really looking forward to focusing on that, getting more into the community. And then, of course, the next step in that iteration, and something I'm most excited about, is the ability to create gaming opportunities for you and me as a community. And that means opening up games on Roll20 that we can invite the community into play, because I know that there's always going to be a need and desire to play more Dungeons & Dragons, and this is the best way I can think of to make that available to our excellent community. Okay, so that's enough gushing about community news. Let's take a look at some of the news and discussions that we had on Twitter this week. Now, first off, my Kraken Dice shipment finally arrived. Not their fault. It's a customs thing. We'll have to sort it out in the future, but I'm really thrilled to see them show up this week, which means I finally have the dice to give away for my 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000 follower milestone. And of course, we'll keep an eye on 5,000 because we'll want to be giving away more dice then too. And we'll look to expand these giveaways in the future. This is really just a nod to the community for participating, for being valuable members of that community, and interacting with me on a regular basis. And of course, for helping us get to 100 plus on YouTube. In addition to that, I lifted the veil on my horribly wrong prediction for the new release of the Wizards of the Coast campaign source book. But I really had a great thought flow, I think, around Laeral Silverhand and the opportunity to bring the Moonshays into the campaign. So if you're interested, do check that out as well, because I still think it would make a great campaign option in the future for players who do want to expand their adventures in Faerun. Wizards, if you're listening, or who knows, maybe we can collaborate on building it ourselves if it doesn't exist. That's the beauty of the Dungeons and the Dragons now, isn't it? Amongst the amazing conversations that came up in the community this week, we focused a little bit on feat and spell combinations to really optimize and create new effects and maximize impact. Let me explain that in a little more detail. First of all, we talked about spell combinations to take your practice into the next level. One of my favorite examples is pairing the Sentinel feat with a halberd or long polearm that has the reach property. What this does is allows you to use Sentinel which gives you an opportunity attack anytime someone comes within range of you. If you strike an opponent with that attack, it makes their movement 0, which will hold them firmly in place. And if they try to attack any other creature than yourself that's within range of you, you can expend your reaction to gain an opportunity attack against that creature. So let's think about a few tenets here. 1, range. When somebody comes into range of you, which is typically 5 feet. 2, when you attack them with an opportunity attack, when they come in 5 feet, their movement is reduced to 0. And 3, if they attack anyone else within range of you, you can use an opportunity attack to attack them back. Where the halberd comes in, and any polearm or weapon that has the reach property, is that it then extends your reach to 10 feet as opposed to 5. So now all those benefits that were reach-based now suddenly have a radius of 10 feet around you, which gives you pretty tremendous control over the battle area and the combat arena. Other opportunities we explored with the community to create these spell-like synergies include Stinking Cloud paired with Web. One I really liked, which came up, was using Message as a cantrip to establish the ability for a creature to hear you, and then saddle in a spell that requires a creature to hear you, like Dissonant Whispers. So imagine you can visualize a creature who's run around the corner. You can cast Message as a cantrip to establish hearing, and then cast Dissonant Whispers on a creature that needs to hear you without actually being able to see them. There are a lot of other applications for this type of spell, and sure, it requires a little bit of DM buy-in, but personally, I think that's freaking cool use, and I would absolutely allow it, particularly if you're setting up combat. You'll also need to make sure that you're under some kind of effect that allows you to cast a cantrip and a slotted spell. But if you use this ability to kick off combat, then you can create the link with Message and then cast the spell to initiate combat. You gotta have to play with your party on that one too. The other two that really stood out for me was the ability to use Light and Thaumaturgy to create a very convincing distraction for your foes. The Eminence of Light, the ability to create sound and project that sound as if though it originated in an environment that's far away from the party. Lots of really creative flexibility that exists there. Light, Thaumaturgy, perfect distraction. And finally, one that's at your disposal as a DM is Scrying. Of course, we have a tendency to take for granted that we have this omniscient view of the entire gaming world, but your NPCs and your bads don't necessarily have that view. And if you throw it in there, you're definitely going to get questions from your players, rightfully so. Scrying allows those bads to actually get a sneak peek at what the players are doing, how they're plotting, how their plans are progressing, and then of course vicariously you can justify using that to your evil means as a dungeon master. Stemming from that, the next thing we talked about as a community was a clever use of spells against a thematic environment or biome, let's say. Specifically, we talked about winter or cold settings or frozen settings, and what spells and feats would really lend well to adventuring in that type of campaign setting. So the community came up with a couple of different options, ones that were intended to combat the cold or exist and survive in the environment, and a set of options that are intended to use or gel with the environment from a combat perspective. The ones we explored to combat the cold included Produce Flame, Create Bonfire, Leomund's Tiny Hut for shelter, of course, paired with Prestidigitation as a nice way to warm up your boots, gear, and provide further ambient shelter from the biting cold. Beyond that, we definitely wanted to consider Mobile to cover and compete in difficult terrain. Really great insight there. And the idea of bringing Control Water or Create and Destroy Water into the environment because, of course, snow and ice still at the end of the day is a water formation. So some really clever ways to use those spells to manipulate your environment and create an advantage for yourself in that biome. Beyond that, spells you could use to harness the cold or use it to your advantage include Ice Knife, Cone of Cold, Ice Lance, and then a really great nod towards the feat Elemental Adept, which means that you're going to be able to control whether or not a creature has resistance to you when using a spell that falls under that particular elemental damage type. Reasonably, when you're in a particularly thematic combat or adventuring environment, you're going to run into creatures that have resistances that are based in that environment. This will let you use those frost or cold-based spells without having to worry about constantly running up against creatures and enemies that are resistant to those effects. So huge thanks for the community for bringing your heads together and offering us some excellent adventuring options for either creating synergy and optimizing effects between spell combinations, and or preparing yourself with thematic spells and feats that mirror the environment you're adventuring in. All right, we're keeping it light on community news and Twitter news today to get straight into DM and player tips. And then, of course, our deep dive on everything you want or need to know about Matt Mercer's pending release of The Explorer's Guide to Wildemount with Wizards of the Coast. Our first and only real DM tip this week was that if a player permadies, make them part of the process. In my games and for a lot of my colleagues, death has to remain a very real and tangible threat in the game in order to inspire the stakes and risks that you want to leverage things like emotional response and commitment from your characters to the campaign. But of course, nobody wants to think about your beloved character dying before their time or unceremoniously. So I really believe that this is a great option to bring DM and player alike, where when a player does meet their untimely or timely demise, that your players be brought into that process as well, so that you can continue to craft the legacy narrative of those characters together. So think about it. When you have a character who's on the verge of perishing or perishes in battle, give them their own "how do you want to do this" moment around their death, just like you would when they are the instruments of death for so many other NPCs and creatures the world over. Next up, we went into player tips, which were really driven around online play or virtual tabletop play this week. So I asked our online D&D players, what are some of your best tips for playing in an online or virtual tabletop format? We had 3 real standout options here. 1, to listen and be ready to stop talking if someone cuts in. I really like this because it is unique to the virtual tabletop environment when you're playing through a VoIP system or a community voice like Discord or Google Hangouts or Zoom or any other conferencing software. Sometimes it can be difficult for people to interject. So in 2 ways, you want to make sure that you're listening for people who are trying to contribute so that you can take a pause and give them the space to do so. And additionally, that you're taking a pause in case anybody wants to speak up but may not have felt like they've had the opportunity. We don't have the luxury of being able to read the table and identifying when someone's about to jump in like we do in person. So that's a great tip that comes from @Shagrazir under the handle DM in the Sky. Thanks for your contribution this week. The next 2 come from community regular @PleasantDoom, aka Angela, who's had some really significant experience playing with players online and DMing online. Number 1 from Angela is to speak up if you can't see what the DM's referencing on the map. Now in VTTs like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, oftentimes the DM will be looking at a section of the map and speaking to the action that's playing in that part of the map. But on your side, you might be looking at a completely different environment or focusing on a different element. So if you don't see what the DM's describing accurately, speak up and say, hey, I'm not sure if I'm looking at the right thing, just to make sure that you can get on board, because it's going to be a lot harder for you to catch up later on in the game. And don't hesitate. We've all been there. We've all had those questions. No one around the table is going to judge you for that, or at least no one around the table should judge you for that. The second tip from Angela is also related to being able to stay in tune with what's happening in the virtual playing field. Specifically, if you have a red-green deficiency that prevents you from determining the contrast on on-screen objects, make sure that you bring that up to your DM as well. This can be a little bit more sensitive and personal, so feel free to take it to DMs or contact your Dungeon Master directly. But absolutely, there are tools in those VTTs to help increase contrast, make sure that on-screen elements are viewable and accessible to everybody. So don't hesitate to talk to your DM about ways that we can work together to help make this a more positive and enjoyable experience for you as an online player. And with that, it's a wrap for DM tips and community news. Let's get into the goods on Matt Mercer and Wizards of the Coast pending release of The Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. Here's everything we know and all the info I was able to grab around the nitty-gritty of what's coming in the new compendium. Welcome to Wildemount. This is the first official release from Matt Mercer and the Critical Role crew, featuring regions of Matt's beloved Exandria campaign world. Now, Wildemount is the setting for the second season of Critical Role, or the Mighty Nine story arc, scheduled for release on March 17th, 2020, and it's the first official source book or source material endorsed or sanctioned by Wizards of the Coast in a published release for Critical Role. And while it's the first official compendium in Matt Mercer's World of Exandria, it's the second professionally published piece following the Green Ronin published compendium sourcebook for Tal'Dorei, which was the home setting for the Vox Machina story arc or season 1 of Critical Role. And that piece was also published in partnership with James Heck, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who's also become a regular name in official published and 5e D&D materials. So what do we know or want to know about Wildemount and Matt Mercer's new campaign setting for D&D 5e, especially if you're not a particular fan or diehard critter following the regular canon and lore around Mercer's Critical Role empire? First of all, Wildemount is a continent setting or a regional setting in the overarching world of Exandria, much like Tal'Dorei is the setting for the first season of Critical Role with Vox Machina, as we mentioned. Wildemount itself is broken up into 4 core regions, including the Menagerie Coast, East and Western Wynandir, and the Biting North or the Frozen Wastes. The content of the campaign setting itself centers around a brewing, brutal war between 2 distinct factions, the Dwindelian Empire and the Kryn Dynasty, which are primarily made of drow circles. Now, these 2 factions are constantly vying for control over the wasted Wildemount and the archaic, powerful artifacts that are left behind during the Divergence, known as the Vestiges of Divergence. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. But effectively, the campaign centered around the constant jockeying for power between these 2 factions as they continue in this endless stalemate over the region Zoras in eastern Wynandir. Whew! It is like learning an entirely new language. So if you're not so enthused about the actual setting of Critical Role in the world of Exandria, the tome still promises a healthy balance of subclasses and spell mechanics, including magical items, monsters, regions, and story hooks that are easily transferable and cross-functional in any D&D world that you choose to play in. And now that this is all considered official under D&D canon, it means that those crossovers are founded in the typically assumed official D&D lore. It's also supposed to come with a tremendous wealth of backstory options and mechanics to allow you to retool how character development is shaped in your world, regardless of where it is. Other items that have been announced as included with the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount: a complete Wildemount gazetteer, which is a geographical index of the region, including everything from cities to biospheres to socioeconomic information, cults, sects, faiths, deities, anything you can think of. Consider it your wikia of Wildemount, particularly including maps and locales, which I think will be a great resource to both Critical Role fans and general D&D fans alike. Also included are monsters, which speak to Matt Mercer's love of monstrous information and monster compendiums and how they play into the world setting as well. This approach to cryptozoology and the danger and beauty that monsters bring to the world and make it unique are something that Matt Mercer has spoken frequently of as a key influencer into how he was brought into creating these magical worlds, infusing those worlds with their own distinct personalities. Now, the varied menagerie of monsters included with Explorer's Guide to Wildemount will bring in 23 completely new monstrous stat blocks, some of which are retoolings or evolved versions of familiar monsters to match the environment from which they came, and some that are completely new works from the mind of Matt Mercer himself. Either way, all these monsters are affected and adapted in the wake of the Calamity, which was the grand sundering of the world of Exandria, which set a lot of these great stories in motion, and we'll get to that in a moment in more detail too. So we'll recognize that some of these monsters have either been weaponized or otherwise utilized, that's a lot of izing, by the Kryn Dynasty to meet their ends, whether it's for dominance or exploration. But they've all evolved and adapted to their surrounding environment. For example, there is a basilisk-like creature that is a subsea organism that uses an oily ink-like secretion to petrify its victims, similar to but different from the traditional basilisk and their stone gaze feature. And as mentioned, those that we've never seen or heard of before and can't wait to get a handle on. Rounding out the core offerings of the new compendium from Wizards and Matt Mercer, of course, include faction information and cultural information for big groups like the Kryn Dynasty and the Dwindelian Empire, and of course the 4 promised adventures that represent the playable component of this new book, one of each rooted in the 4 regions as promised promised by the tome. Now, among the information we already know about the new book, the Wizards has already teased the existence of the Echo Knight and 2 other subclasses, more to come on that, as well as the implementation of Dunemancy, which is an entirely new magic structure that allows users to manipulate time and space to create alternate physical effects. It sounds very Doctor Strange-ish when you look into it. Beyond that, the book is said to feature over 300 pages of material and lots of mention of how very packed the book actually is, with lots of great information and resources to use. Now, it's worth noting that the Critical Role team has sourced a lot of the art and resources for the book from the Critical Role community itself. Of course, Critical Role being notorious for being heavily engaged with and involved in the community that supports it. But they've actually sourced more than half of the art in the book from that community at large. Matt Mercer himself, quoting, "We look for as many opportunities as we can to include them in the things that we do." And that's clearly evident in how they've rolled out art and sourcing visuals for this type of book. Now, as we mentioned, this is the first official campaign setting, net new, that Wizards has ever introduced since Eberron, which was also part of a very community-based driven sourcing process. But the Critical Role community is still left with some unanswered questions, which hopefully we'll get more line of sight into as more announcements and information comes available, specifically around the Blood Hunter class, Matt Mercer's infamous Blood Hunter set, but it is not official canon yet. Will it be included with the Wildemount campaign setting? Who knows? Fans are also left wondering if the Way of the Kobold Soul will make an appearance in the new book, which is the monastic tradition practiced by the character Bo in Season 2 of Critical Role. A third hot point that has yet to be determined is where this leaves the Green Ronin published of Taldore as the other side of Exandria's source materials. But with enough crossover, it reasons that both will be presumed to exist in the same types of games. Of course, my disclaimer to this is, as a dungeon master and as a table that runs the game, it's up to you to determine what best suits your world. So if you want to use both in tandem, no one should be judging you or really getting bent up over your use of those supplements or materials. But for people who like to have their decisions more rooted in the canon or lore, it'll be interesting to see how the reality of these two official publications from different publishers will be expected to work together in harmony to create the world of Exandria. And of course, leaving fans of other settings waiting and wondering when their chance is going to come. The most popular amongst those being, of course, Darksun, Greyhawk, Planescape, and Spelljammer. But hey, it's a long year, and presumably Wizards is going to come out with some other things, right? So the day is still young. Now remember, Wizards already opened the gates to Matt Mercer's Exandria by bringing Joe Manganiello's character Archon the Cruel into canon officially released materials, specifically Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. In doing that, they already created the crossover and conduit that linked Mercer's world into the official D&D lore anyway, so this really shouldn't be terribly surprising to anyone. They further broke the mold into bringing IPs from third-party creators into official canon with the release of Acquisitions Incorporated. Now, of course, Chris Perkins had a big part to play in that, but effectively it was a Penny Arcade brainchild, if I'm not mistaken. So this is not the first time that a third-party creator has had their idea lifted and brought into the official D&D library. And in fact, in a lot of ways, I think it makes more sense than any previous such iteration of those types of materials. There's no denying Critical Role's positive impact on the game or Wizards' business overall. All we're doing is making it official. Wizards and Critical Role going steady. Getting back to the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount, clearly this and other materials that come from Matt Mercer's whimsical ideation deeply reflects and embodies his personal interest in the elements of time and the passage of time, the effect it has on us and everyone in it, and what, if any, is our ability to manipulate and change our destinies, paths, parallel existences, and all things in between. So expect to see some of that resonant throughout the entire piece and narrative works in the new coming book on March 17th. All right, so that's our primer on everything you want to know and what we know currently about the new release of Wildemount from Wizards of the Coast. Let's take it down a level and look at some of the most interesting components that I feel really make this a different experience. Number 1, adventuring in Wildemount. How does it feel to exist in and play through this campaign setting itself as a player and run as a dungeon master or game master? First of all, as we mentioned, it seems like there's going to be a lot of resources. It's just chock full of things that you can retool, repurpose, and use as a DM in any campaign setting or application that you like. Beyond that, there are 4 distinct adventures that are rooted in each of the 4 unique regions of Wildemount. The first one is the Menagerie Coast, which is a coastal-like seafaring setting set to cater to those who want a more ship-faring, possibly swashbuckling type high seas adventure, featuring the Clovis Concord. I hope I didn't screw that up. Critters, forgive me, I'm trying real hard here. The second centers around Western Wynendir, which is where the Dwindelian Empire makes its home. Definitely more city and civic focus, this arc promises more political intrigue, influence, power jockeying, and other types of social hurdles that exist in and around the city of Hyperduke. Now, the second arc centers around Western Wynendir, which promises to be more politically charged, more about social influences and the nuances and intrigue that exist in the inner sanctum of these warring factions. As the home of the Dwindelian Empire, most of this promises to center around the city of Hyperduke. The third arc rounds out ongoings in Eastern Wynendir, where the Kryn Dynasty makes its home, or, like we said, primarily Drow factions. This is the seat of the blasted land of Zoras and focuses on the dynasty's push into the current war, where the players will find themselves in the middle of a military campaign on behalf of the Kryn dynasty. Now, faced with their military objectives, there's presumably or teasedly going to be some kind of mystical or unforeseen issue or challenge that takes that campaign off course into something completely unforeseen. The fourth and final arc takes players into the biting north, or the glacial frozen wastes of Wildemount, where some mystical power rooted in the ancient legacy of Divergence has said to left some dormant power awaiting explorers to unearth, or unice. So now that we've got the lay of the land, I wanted to look a little bit further into Matt Mercer's Dunemancy, or this new magic practice altogether. But what is Dunemancy and how does it work? Well, as we mentioned, it's a magic practice that's rooted in the manipulation and or archaic understanding of time, space, and how they influence our physical reality. Now, Dunemancy is an entirely new family of magic rather than a school itself, and it was developed by the Kryn dynasty amidst the discovery of these powerful artifacts that they had unearthed over time. It's been called space-time magic by Matt Mercer and really said to exist around the butterfly effect and the ripple effect that our actions have today on the time yet to come. Now, this works around the potentiality of outcomes, as Mercer himself has put it, your ability to, in a moment, affect the outcome of things that are yet to be based on your knowledge of how space and time work. Whew. Yeah, it's a little Doctor Strangey, or maybe just a little strangey. Now, this ultimately speaks to destiny and how we're on a timed track and an individual's ability to meet the intersection of reality and future to create new outcomes that play in your favor. Practitioners of this new magical channel have the ability to reach through that time and space and cure the powers of omniscience to see all in that moment. Mechanically, it's akin to flavors that we see in D&D, like clairvoyance, haste, speed, slow, things like that affect the passage of time and how it affects physical beings in that moment. And narratively, we've seen this evident in the use of Caleb, who is a sorcerer in the second season of Critical Role, played by Liam O'Brien. In that, we've seen a couple of examples that Matt Mercer alluded to, including Fortune's Favor, which, as he calls it, is a fragment of possibility, like an aura that allows you to adjust probability in your favor in a certain sphere of influence around the caster. It plays out like a spell granted luck point, which lets you add a d20 or essentially roll with advantage for any d20 check. Another spell effect that Matt Mercer outlined in an interview with D&D Beyond was Gravity Fissure, which is the ability to project in a straight line ahead of you, almost like a magnetic gravity field that pulls characters or creatures into its wake, and then crushes them with gravitational force. The third effect we know that exists under this Dunemancy sphere is called Reality Break, which is a caster's ability to afflict a creature with suffering, traumatic, haunting images and almost pull them out of their current timeline, subject them to a horrific alternate timeline, and then bring them back with all the trauma and cause and affliction that comes with something like that. Gotta admire the creativity there. So this creates random horror-based alternate reality effects that continue to persist against the target of this ability. Needless to say, Dunemancy is definitely the type of arcane implementation that can open a wealth of narrative possibilities as well for player, GM, and Dungeon Master alike. One of the 3 subclasses that I took a deeper dive into was the previously teased Echo Knight. Now, Echo Knights are elite warriors of the Kryn Dynasty who leverage elements of Dunemancy in a combat-oriented way. As called out by Matt Mercer himself, they are definitely and very much a martial-oriented class. So from what we gather, the Echo Knight pulls from dying timelines, or rather, when timelines diverge in alternate realities, they die and fade over time as they fail to continue. An Echo Knight's power allows them to reach into those dying timelines and pull alternate realities from them and bring them into the present moment. This creates a shade or echo-like version of the Knight to do whatever they want with, very much like a familiar or pet-based subclass feature. With that echo or shade, if you will, the Echo Knight can deploy spells and effects either through themselves or through their familiar version of themselves. They can trade places, and they can use a variety of other abilities that speak to this continued focus on manipulating time and position. These echo shades can act like a familiar or an avatar, like a projected version of yourself, and presumably a number of other creative ways to use those powers. But either way, it's definitely a martial-oriented type of class or subclass, and I think we can reasonably assume that this will be a fighter subclass in the new book. The second subclass that I wanted to take a deeper look into was the Chronurgist. Now, the Chronurgist is very much a wizard tradition. It's been confirmed. So this is more like a school where Chronurgists are able to manipulate time, outcomes, and potential influences or effects on our existence with the use of spell effects that we might be familiar with, like banishment or control effects, time manipulation, and other spell customizations. To use Matt Mercer's own words in describing this subclass, the Chronurgist manipulates small points of localized time that they have control over in order to give them an edge on the battlefield. One of the feats he suggested is the ability to temporarily freeze a creature in stasis that can also be used to hold and protect companions and other various ways to gain an edge on or an escape from the battlefield. So this sounds something like a time sorcerer, again drawing back to the Doctor Strange analogy, but again very much a wizard subclass. So the third and final subclass that's been officially announced, and one that I am more excited about than I thought I would be, is a Graviturgist. As the name would suggest, the Graviturgist focuses on the manipulation of the presence of gravity, gravity fields, and how gravity affects creatures and individuals in the current plane of material existence. Now, Graviturgists can also use their abilities to manipulate the density and effects of gravity on creatures, including themselves. As I understand it, a Graviturgist uses a sliding scale type format to determine the strength and richness of their abilities versus the increased or lowered intensity of their effects and outcomes of those abilities. So I'm theorizing, but presumably by that logic, it means you have the ability to determine how much power goes into an ability to create either more targets or less targets with more impactful outcomes, or more targets with lighter versions of those spells. Either way, the Graviturgist can clearly manipulate the environment to not only affect creatures through the manipulation of their gravity impact, but can also create buffs or support effects that can turn the tide of how battle plays out for their companions. This causes the Graviturgist to force that center of gravitational power around and emanating from themselves. But it sounds like there are some really cool effects in store for that, and a complete new imagination of how positional magic can work and how buffs and support options are available to new subclasses in the book. Now, all that said, what I don't really have anything concrete on is what subclass this might belong to. It could very easily make a nice bard subclass or a sorceress subclass, which so far hasn't been attended to, but there are a lot of classes that haven't been addressed yet in this purported wealth of options that'll be available to players. So only time will tell what class the Graviturgist actually belongs to. We'll have to wait and see. The final piece that I'm going to cover in this deep dive, and one of the most intriguing to me, is the existence of the Vestiges of Divergence. So as we mentioned, the Divergence was the event created when the walking gods left the world of Exandria amidst the calamity and the war that served to break the world. They diverged from this plane when they left it, thusly calling it the Divergence. Now, at this point where the gods left Exandria, they also left behind extremely powerful ancient relics scattered throughout the world. The leaving of these articles in their wake was what were known as the Vestiges of Divergence. The Vestiges of Divergence themselves are mechanically designed to awaken or evolve with characters that wield or hold them as their stories evolve too, and as they cross these emotional or story-based milestones or significant events that impact their future. Of course, when the gods left Exandria amidst the conflict of the Great Calamity, these vestiges slowly started to depreciate or deteriorate over time, ultimately becoming completely dormant and seemingly devoid of all their former magic glory. The use of and experience in wielding or holding and carrying these items throughout a character's life offers the opportunity for those vestiges to once again become infused with their former power. This happens across 3 tiers for these types of items. One is dormant, where they represent fairly respectable magic items. Then into awakened, where they're starting to come back into their former glory or rekindle their conduit to their former godlike powers. And then the 3rd tier, which is exalted, and presumably the final stage of realization that these ancient relics once had. This is near and dear to me because I've used this mechanic in my own games. I call them legacy items. It's a little bit different where my characters will start with an item that's tied to their backstory and acts as an anchor for them to the world. And like the Vestiges of Divergence, will evolve and empower over time as the characters become more familiarized with and proficient with their use. So I love to see this formalized and actually intrinsically woven into the campaign history too. And it takes away the loot hogging need to collect gear to progress your character, and gives you an option that's tied to individually you. So I'm really excited to see how this type of idea might play out in an official material that is D&D lore. But of course, be wary, as Matt Mercer himself has alluded, not all Vestiges of Divergence were the fruits of good or well-intentioned labor. So that's a bit of a 101 on all things we know about official information released around Matt Mercer and Wizards of the Coast's pending release of the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount on March 17th. Whether you're a fan of Critical Role or not, if you're a fan of the game, then there are bound to be a couple of great items in there that you can pull, use, reimagine, rework, retool. Just stay tuned into the positive influence that Matt Mercer's crew and the entertainment that the Critical Role gang have brought us, because I truly do feel that they've more than earned their seat at the table. So we'll keep an eye out for other news and little teases and releases as they come available. But for now, that is a wrap for your Dungeons & Dragons weekly news on the Speaking Common podcast for Saturday, January 18th. Stay tuned throughout the week, and of course, follow me on Twitter at ShamBasilGames as always. And please do, if you have a moment, throw me a quick subscribe, hit the bell, join the 112 people who are now woke to what we bring every week. And I'll continue to try to do my best to bring you some value and hopefully some entertainment along the way. Lots of more daily content to come from myself, Brad, aka ShamBasilGames. So happy gaming adventures. Until next time, keep it right here for more Dungeons & Dragons news, interviews, and unearthed arcana. Have a great weekend.